we live in a time of great irony, a great time, too, of struggle, and a time of hope. The great irony we have, I think the greatest irony of all, is simply that in 1982 we passed a constitution which established for the first time, and for the first time in the whole history of our country, that we had written into our law the concept of freedom of expression, thought, belief, and opinion, and expressed it to be absolute, subject only to such reasonable limits as were demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. Glowing words, and ironically the time coincided with the beginning of the disintegration of the very concept which until then had been enshrined not so much in written laws, but in the thoughts and in the hearts and in the deeds of people long before 1982. And therefore the great irony is that the time of establishing in a written form the words freedom of thought, belief, and expression was the time when those concepts and those ideas began to become unreal and to, in fact, begin to disappear. Because once you write a thing down, you think you can forget it. You know how people with a short memory often do that. I do it myself. I should do it more. But when you think you're not going to remember something, you write it down so you can forget it. And you think the piece of paper will remind you. Well, freedom is one of the few words that when written down is not remembered. Freedom is one of those few words which is only meaningful when it is real in the heart. It is never real on the paper unless it is real in the heart. And so that irony of writing the word has allowed relaxation of the belief that it must be written in the heart. And there are those of us in this society who are prepared to write it in our hearts and to live it in our lives. And as a result, it is ironic too that we have seen a greater influx of the belief that we must prosecute with criminal sanctions ideas which some segment of society or other does not approve of. And it should not be forgotten that there are some segments of society who are never satisfied until the only reasonable opinions are their own. Another great irony is that after approximately 40 years of peace and basically harmonious relations between a vast diversity of members of ethnic and religious orders and beliefs, there are some vicious individuals and vicious groups of people who believe we must now resurrect whatever there was in the way of animosity from the Second World War. There is, of course, the Duchesne Commission report, which established that after 40 or so years we must now begin to track down those who some people say did the wrong thing in war. Well, war itself is the wrong thing. And in war, all things done against the enemy are right. But what makes it right now to begin? What makes it right now to begin, after that period of time, to prosecute our enemies by laws that did not exist when those deeds were done, by laws which had no meaning whatsoever in the places where those deeds occurred, and requiring of those individuals against whom those charges are brought the obligation to defend themselves against accusations by those with professional memories who never forget. With possible evidence from real human beings like every one of us who is fallible and can seldom remember the faces, let alone the eyes, of anyone 40 years ago. I'm sure that I haven't, in my youth, been able to remember anything in my finest hours of mental capacity, and that's long past, according to Paul Fromm. When I could remember anything 2 years ago with real accuracy. And as a lawyer, I've cross-examined many people who thought they remembered something 6 months ago. And I would defy any one of you to remember the first person you spoke to when you came into this room 20 minutes ago. If anyone here can tell me in absolute truth who the first person was they spoke to 20 minutes ago or whenever you came into this room, I'd ask you to raise your hand. I don't think 10% of the audience has done that, and I suspect that the people who raised their hands are with their wives or husbands. That just goes to show you just a little bit of the difficulties faced by these people who now are subject to secret investigation in some cases, secret condemnation, not by any open trials, but the Duchesne Commission may well have taken and made judgments against individuals that were totally unknown to those same people. You can buy the public volume with the numbered accounts, some 200 or 300 people that have been investigated. How many of those people knew they were being investigated? How many of those people were given an opportunity to reply? And if they wanted not to testify, could they have refused? Do we allow the right to remain silent for those people? I think not. I think the whole political decision by the Prime Minister of this country to resurrect the struggles, difficulties, hardships, recriminations, and animosity of the Second World War will go down as a testament to the most cowardly act of a most despicable Prime Minister. He pronounced his own description at the very outset of his career, when in a moment, I gather, of somewhat relaxed and less than circumspect words, he announced to the media that there was no like an old, and that he was and is. You'll notice I didn't fill in the blanks, because I'm afraid we don't live in a society where I would feel safe to fill in the blanks, even against a statement I knew to be true. And that, to me, is the greatest irony. And it's also ironic that the only solution to those types of events is the same solution it was throughout history when people were challenged by oppression, by lies, by the power of corrupt governments. The same solution exists. It is the solution of courage that must and can only reside within the human heart devoted to the ideals of forefathers who cherished the same values that we're here to discuss tonight. We have in this country since 1982 banned more books. And as a person involved in the communication of ideas, I can tell you that we emphatically require, in my opinion, and I'll constantly reiterate the word in my opinion, because I'll tell you in a little while how a court allowed someone to be called a perverted monster because it was someone else's opinion. But we have allowed, in my opinion, the introduction of a whole concept of state control of the mind that is no different in degree and no less in quality than that imposed on the people of the Soviet Union in the times of Stalin and to a large extent today. Let me begin by describing, for those of you who are not as familiar as I, the precise nature of this process of book banning. I, as a criminal lawyer, am well familiar with the process by which an accused person, when charged with an offense, in some cases as serious as robbery, is taken before a judge, and in some cases a justice, And the Crown has the burden to justify in the public interest why the accused should be detained before trial. And if no good reason is provided, the justice or judge is obliged by law to release that person. And that, in my opinion, is fair, because an innocent person ought not to be kept in jail awaiting their trial to determine if they are or are not guilty. In our forebearers' concept of justice, the presumption of innocence required that we do not have punishment before we have trial. But let me tell you that for a book that is not charged with armed robbery or violence or murder or any form of danger to the human person who will choose not to open the book, a book, on the other hand, by the Canadian government is incarcerated before trial and held until the person who wants to claim it can prove that it is not guilty. That, to me, is irony. And when the submissions were requested by the very tribunal under the Customs and Excise Act, when they said to us, "Oh, tell us, how should we conduct these bannings of books? Please make suggestions and submissions to tell us how we should impose reasonable restrictions to keep out very bad books." And we did provide suggestions, and one of them was that if the government is deeming it necessary to seize a book from a private individual, they should have to first of all prove in a court that the book is guilty of some offense, if that is the way they wish to ban books. We filed these submissions, and they were completely and utterly ignored. And the definitions that were imposed did not provide any presumption of innocence for a book. The same procedures avail. And let me tell you exactly how they operate. If you, for instance, wish to import a book from another country where free citizens are allowed to read it, such as in the United States, you must be sure that it isn't on the banned book list. But you cannot get a complete banned book list. They'll send you a volume of papers which are printed from time to time, with many books they deem bad, most of them sexual in nature, but interspersed among them are books of a religious nature, books of a political nature, and books that are generally unacceptable to certain groups of individuals who seem to have the desire and certainly the capacity to influence their government. If the government's customs inspectors deem a book to be banned, and they do the deeming, no judge does the deeming, you are not present to say anything in defense of the book. You are not allowed to know it has been banned until the banning is completed. But you do have the right to appeal to a higher official, and the official is another civil servant. And you have the right to apply to an even higher civil servant, and that civil servant is the last civil servant. He is the deputy minister. And the deputy minister has a form letter which he sends to provide you with the explanation as to why the book is banned. The explanation says the book is banned, in the previous case, under Tariff Item 99201-1, signed the Deputy Minister of Finance, National Revenue. That's the reason for the banning of the book. In case you didn't notice, that is the end of it. You then have a right to appeal to the courts. And as General Counsel of the Canadian Free Speech League, an organization whose objectives were somewhat like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, but who found the Canadian Civil Liberties Association was not interested in pursuing these matters, we then took a case from one Hugh Thompson, and I have his permission to mention the difficulties arising in that case, because it involved the import of a book that was banned in Canada. It was of a political nature, I can assure you. It didn't have any dirty pictures, and I don't think it had any dirty dialogue unless one was willing to make political judgments. And when we wanted to appeal, we had to pay, of course, first of all $50 to file the notice. That's not too bad. Then we had to advertise in the Government Gazette in Ottawa. We we have to pay for the publication, we have to provide the copy, and when we did, they sent it back and said it wasn't what they liked. We had to return another copy and some more money, $100, and for the trial it has to be published 3 months before the trial, or some period before the trial. And when we got to the trial and found out it hadn't been published within the 3 months, although they had canceled and deposited our check, we couldn't proceed with the trial because there was no publication in the Government Gazette. They had taken our money, cashed our check, and failed or refused to publish. It took them several months to admit that, and then they wanted some more money to publish a second time, having not done it the first time. As I recall, after a long exchange of letters, the money in the first instance was never returned. Let me tell you these problems, but let me warn you in advance that there is a solution, and it isn't something you should be discouraged about, it's something you should know about. And if somebody will get me a drink of water, I'll carry on. This Toronto water has the habit of making one thirsty. I come from a part of the world where the water is quite soft. In Victoria, you know, it rains more than it does here. And I really was enjoying the water in Toronto until I found out it came out of Lake Ontario. Thank you. But by that time I was hooked on it and wasn't much I could do about it. In any event, at the end of the exercise of exchanging back and forth letters that are required to be translated into 2 languages in Ottawa, we came to the conclusion that we had satisfied that requirement and fixed another date, got to court. The Crown prosecutor showed up with a lady from Ottawa who'd come all the way to fight this little group of books. And Lola Seltzer, her name was. I'd never seen this lady before. She seemed to know all about these cases because she travels all over the country, apparently, with concerns of this kind. And I can assure you she wasn't on our side of the fence. In any event, the first argument of the Crown prosecutor was, although the section says to appeal to the County Court of Victoria, or the county where the taxpayer lives, you're in the wrong court. And if you're in the wrong court, you're also out of time. Lovely, lovely, lovely little catch-22 situation, so they don't have to decide on the validity of the legislation, and they don't have to decide on the validity of the book. You're in the wrong court. Why are you in the wrong court? Because you're challenging the legislation, and if you wish to challenge the legislation under the Charter, you have to be in the federal court. So no suggestion of this type having been made, and the county court judge being most interested not to get too involved in a situation such as this, he ruled, quite right, you're in the wrong court. So after about 2.5 years of struggle with that particular book, we had to appeal to the federal court, and that, I suppose, is underway, and we now have to prepare all sorts of new arguments, and I would think probably 300 or 400 hours have been spent by various people, not just myself, trying to fight for the right to read one book, or maybe 3 or 4 books, that the Government of Canada deems unacceptable. And if that isn't ironic, what is? If that isn't the indication of a thought police and a mind control, what is? And why do they wish to control the mind in this way? There's no opposition to the vast majority of destructive ideas. There's no suggestion that anyone can oppose or disagree on many ideas in Canada. But if there are unpopular or customary or unconventional ideas, the government deems them incapable for you and me to choose between, and they don't trust us to exercise the brains and the common sense God gave us. Well, of course, you're well aware that book banning is not the only problem. You're also, I think, aware that 2 or 3 or maybe more people are being prosecuted not for the advocacy of violence, not for the commission of any act, but for the nonviolent communication of ideas that others deem offensive. It is very dangerous for anyone of any group or any ideology to take the position in this unstable world that the ideas they dislike must be forbidden. Because I can assure you that history is full of examples of the rapid rate at which political power can change hands. And when it does, those people who have exercised the most vicious attitude of oppression against someone else will invariably and inevitably become the victims of the very laws they formulated for their enemies. And if anyone ever believes that might makes right, or if anyone ever believes that political power justifies itself, or if anyone ever believes that there is no hope for the small but truthful dedication of ordinary citizens to their rights and their beliefs, they should indeed take heart from the courage and the sacrifice and the dedication of those who today are prepared to lay down their lives for their freedom in Palestine. It should awaken in those who today in this country are prepared to impose such laws a very obvious concern. It should awaken in them the thought that if all that power and all that military equipment and all that money cannot destroy the spirit of those people, such that the tide can turn against their oppressors, then it might be wise to recognize now that even ideas we don't like, even ideas we find distasteful, and maybe in some cases consider hateful, are far better to tolerate and to answer with reasons and arguments than to answer with oppression, which could quickly turn from the oppressed upon the oppressors themselves. I most certainly won't discuss any particular case in detail tonight. I don't think it's necessary, because the details of a case are unique to the case. But the principles of a case are universal to us all, if that case, and all cases do to some extent, but if that case involves fundamental issues, then it really doesn't matter whether you or I agree with the person charged. Their rights, their concerns, must be our concerns. If freedom is to be real, it must be protected not only for me, but for my enemy. And if anything has been borne out and proven true through years and years of historical development, is the simple fact that given an open forum and a free marketplace of ideas, the truth will inevitably prevail, and no one should have fear or doubt about that. No one, that is, who believes in the truth or believes in the capacity of the ordinary citizen to make up their mind. And it's a very contemptuous group of people, a very arrogant group of people, who could ever believe that they should decide for me. And all I can tell you is that my background is such that there is a motto for the country that my ancestors came from, which I must say in a way is a little unchristian. It is a motto which I first learned in the Latin language, a language with which I am not particularly familiar, but with which someone else was and told me what it meant. It is a motto which I think depicts the basic position of everyone if you are pushed too far. If you are pushed to the point where your basic beliefs are no longer freely expressed, you will say what this motto says. And anyone who dares to push one human being to that length will find this motto written at the bottom of the heart of every human being. That motto is Nemo me impune lacessit. It means no one provokes me with impunity. It means, in the end, if you will drive from me every element of self-respect, if you will in the end pursue an oppressive course to the extent that I have nothing left to lose. You will find in me and every normal, decent human being the will to fight. And that will. And that will had better not be tested by these groups of people who today insist on prosecuting other people's ideas. I wish to discuss, because I have the permission of the person involved, briefly the case of John Ross Taylor. The John Ross Taylor case is a matter of public record and public knowledge, so I'm not breaching any confidences here when I tell you what has happened. He was first of all stopped by the Human Rights Commission for tape recording a message on a telephone answering machine that you could not get unless and until you phoned the number that he circulated on a piece of paper. So any offense to anyone would have to be sought by the person dialing the phone. The Human Rights Commission didn't like the message. There was no suggestion that it promoted hatred to the extent of any form of violence, but of course hatred is a subjective thing. It is a subjective thing which has now become entrenched as the power and absolute discretion, I think, of some judges to interpret, so that what they hate becomes the law. What they hate becomes forbidden, and what someone else doesn't like cannot be expressed. That's the form of absolute discretion which endowed judges with far too much power. A power that cannot be questioned by law and cannot be opposed except by other legislation. And in a country like this, where we have nothing but cowards for politicians, then who can you trust? By an order of the Human Rights Commission, he was forbidden to make such messages and ordered to stop such messages. So he recorded other messages and carried on. Then they sent him eventually to jail for a year for contempt, and when he got out, he recorded different messages, one of which I recall very well was read from the Toronto Star. Yeah. Well, if there's anyone here from the Toronto Star tonight, I would be delighted to ask them to leave, because you can imagine, and I'll tell you in a little while if you haven't any doubt about it, what I think in the media is not fit to print. Well, not making any comment on Mr. Taylor's judgment about the quality of what he read, it could hardly be said that what he read was any different than what everyone else in the public read. In fact, what he was accused of saying, at one point a judge of the Federal Court of Appeal, and I took that appeal, said, "Why, you can't say that about someone." He said, "The mayor of North York, blank, is a blank." Or no, excuse me, he said, "The mayor of North York, blank, comma, blank." Excuse me, I made a mistake. He said, "The mayor of North York, blank, comma, a blank," then it went on. You got it? Okay? He was reading the article, that, and I checked this out, he was reading it correctly. But the judge of the federal court said, "You can't say that about someone." I said, "Why not? Is there anything wrong?" "Well, certainly it can't be an insult. If it's the truth, what's wrong with being a blank?" Well, he said, "I don't think that you can get away with saying that." I said, "But I believe it says it's a quote from the newspaper." And he said, "I don't, that's not possible. It's not possible." You see, these discussions in these types of appeals are not entirely recorded. I'm giving you my general impression, but I think it's reasonably accurate. And I have witnesses here to prove it, so in case anybody has any doubt about it. So that afternoon we went over to the Vancouver Public Library and asked for that edition of the Toronto Star, and of course because Toronto is the center of the country and sometimes thinks it's the center of the world. lo and behold, they had it. And lo and behold, he was absolutely right. So I went back with the Toronto Star article and read it to them. And they said, well, so what? You're here to argue your case. Don't you tell us. And then another point was made. It said something about Revelations 2:9 and 3:9. And the judges got one of them, I recall, got very, very amused at this. 29 and 39, it said. And he said, look at this, he says. I've looked in my Bible and there's no Revelations 29 and 39 there. Well, I'll tell you, I wasn't too amused. I checked that out, and they'd forgotten the two little dots between the 2:9 and the 3:9. And I said, excuse me, my lords, this is a transcript made by somebody who probably didn't know the Bible, from an oral discussion. And when it said 2:9, they put 29. And when it said 3:9, they put 39. Now, if you ever want to look up Revelations 2:9 and 3:9, am I right, sir? Yeah. You might see what it was. I'm not going to dare say it here. But anyway, I pointed out to them that there was a Revelations 2:9 and 3:9. And they said, oh, so what? It boiled down to this, that they said that although truth was not a defense, the charter was not a relevant issue because it was contempt of court, it wasn't a substantive matter that they would invoke the charter to prevent. Well, I'll tell you, we realized then that it's not so much who you are, it's what you say. Whether society sees you as having, I should say, established society. And this is where I think the greatest problem lies. And this is where the struggle lies. I've talked to you about irony, and I'm just talking to you about irony now. I'm going to talk to you about struggle in a little while, and I'm going to talk to you about hope in a little while. But here's the irony. This individual, who had done nothing to anyone, hadn't murdered his wife and paid $1 million to a lawyer to acquit him, couldn't get the help of the Ontario Legal Aid Society, although he didn't have two beans to rub together. They said it's a hopeless case because the charter is not at stake. Well, being, as I said, one of those Scots that takes the view no one provokes me with impunity, I said, blank, blank. And on behalf of the particular individual, I filed an appeal or application for what's called leave to appeal in the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada, of course, is a very busy court. There are appeals from all over the 10 provinces and 2 territories. They hear many applications for leave, and I'm not positive, but I suspect they allow about 5%. And that's because they just don't have time, I think, among other things. They're a court in which you cannot expect, because you might have what you think is a just cause, to necessarily get an appeal by any means, or even a right to make an appeal. And that's the way it is. And of all those cases that were heard, this was one that they granted leave to appeal for. And I'm very, very grateful for that. But I didn't realize that what it creates is an enormous, costly burden on anyone who wishes to help that individual, and no one else is. So in respect to this instance, and in respect to the book banning case I mentioned, we had earlier formed the Canadian Free Speech League with the specific objective of raising funds from donors who don't necessarily wish to support the individual's point of view, but want to hold that that individual ought to be free to have that view, and who know full well that the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is, in my considered opinion, not interested in these cases. We have built up a little body of people who work very hard to publish this information when we know very well it won't be published anywhere else. We well know the irony of free speech is that it's for the media, but it's not for us. They can say what they like, but it's not for us. We're to listen, they're to speak, and they're to be free, and we're to shut up. That's Canadian free speech today. For those of you who are concerned, and I shared that concern at the beginning of the evening, the gentleman standing to my left assures me he's not in the media. He gave me his card, so I'm sure I know who he is. But you know, I wouldn't frankly be willing to say these things in front of the media because I am positive whatever I said would be twisted. I'm positive I would be vilified. And as a result of my recent experiences with the media, and I want to point out that the media are largely the cause of the problem because they never see free speech. They never see free speech as anybody's issue but their own. And they never see free speech for John Ross Taylor or Ernst Zundel or James Keekstra or anybody with whom they think they should disapprove or disagree. They just don't see free speech then. And I have made a vow as a result of my recent experiences. And it has given me a deep sense of peace. I feel like I've been born again, brothers. I have realized the message of hope I have for all of you is this. Here's the message, brothers. Pass the plate. The message is this, that we should destroy the power they have to control the minds of men and women by ignoring them. And I made a promise to myself that I have so far been able to keep, that for the rest of my natural life, however long that may be, I will never again knowingly speak to a member of the media per se, except as a human being without any other restrictions. And I will not speak to them ever again knowing them to be in the media. Now you might think, and a lot of people think, that this means you will never be able to communicate. Well, it doesn't. In fact, it means you will begin to communicate for the first time in your life, because we will be speaking to each other in a situation where you can see me and I can see you, and you can judge the truth without their telling you what to think. The reason we as a people are in this predicament is because we have not gone to meetings, we have not sought to become informed on the real issues, and like many dolts in society, we've sat back and watched television, got the sanctioned view of the world through the whatever size screen you have in your living room. You and I are as guilty as anyone of the destruction of our own freedom by our ignorance. And consequently, we're now engaged here tonight in doing more to defeat oppression and lies, which the media generally purvey, than any other group of people in this city right now. And that is a tribute to you. And it is my commitment to carry on in this same vein, to continue to communicate what I understand to be going on to whoever is willing and interested to listen, and thereby we can grow and build a body of people who understand really what is happening and will do more than sit, will do more than talk, will fight for those values that we believe in and not allow them to be stolen and thrown into the trash can of history by a media who has no regard for us, our values, or our heritage. Now let me finally address the final irony. There's many more, of course, of which I will speak tonight. The final irony, I think, is this, that I am supposed to be someone who, being concerned about freedom of speech, have sued in a civil court against someone who dared to identify me as a perverted monster. Now, One might say, and it has often been said, why would Doug Christie, who alleges he believes in freedom of speech, sue some nice, harmless, jovial media person who simply merely gives his opinion that he, Doug Christie, is a perverted monster? Why, after all, that is fair comment, isn't it? Well, that's exactly what the jury found. To me, the irony is quite the reverse. Here am I saying no one should be criminally prosecuted for holding their beliefs honestly, whatever those beliefs may be, and they need not justify them as anything more, if they are, than the views of some bigot, if they like. Bigots can have opinions. Bigots like Gary Bannerman can call me a perverted monster. But no. He must be free to say that to 50,000 people who have never met me, have never heard me, except from him. That he is free to do, but Ernst Zundel, James Keegstra, John Ross Taylor, they must go to jail. That's irony. But let me say that it's irony that can be cured. If the society in which we live is prepared to struggle for the values I've endeavored to articulate, if the people who hold information that is deemed to be true and others are interested in hearing are willing to fight for the right to do so, we can be free to speak. We can, if we organize in groups like this and in others throughout every concerned part of society. By supporting those who are under attack, we will make it impossible for those who are attacking to attack us. It is a rare honor and a privilege for anyone in a society such as this to be attacked. It is a rare honor and a privilege in a corrupt society to be vilified. It is a compliment to one's integrity to be insulted by a fool. So, of course, the great enemy of this struggle would be fear. It's really not too hard to cause people to be interested, and many courageous people have come forward, but at every turn they have been systematically squelched or oppressed or lost their jobs or lost their reputation or been vilified. Now, that is possible for 5 people. It is possible for 10 people. It is difficult for 20 people. It is more difficult to do that to 50 people, and it is utterly impossible to do that to 1,000 people. But where are there 1,000 people with the courage to fight as these few have already fought? The answer, of course, lies within each of you. And are you prepared to allow your values, traditions, heritage, and freedom to be destroyed by the elimination of 3 or 4 people that are called malevolent cranks or perverted monsters? Or are you willing to stand beside them and say, you call them whatever you like, but when you do, you're calling that me too? That's the kind of strength and courage it'll take, and nothing less will do. You may not even like standing beside some of these people. I really don't care, because you have the God-given right to do so and the God-given duty to do so. And that's where it is right now. The struggle, if it is somebody else's, ought to be yours. It ought to be mine. It ought to be ours. And it ought to be held with every manner of respect and dignity that we're capable of showing to everybody else, and carried on with courage and relentless pursuit of the one ideal that government has no mandate to dictate truth. And this struggle has not been fought by any one generation and will never be won. It is a struggle fought now by people who have forgotten how to fight, and that's the sad part. We've been fat and lazy too long. We've regarded money and comfort and luxury and basically apathy as a solution to the problem of who we really are. And consequently, when I say there's a struggle to become who we really are, and to have the courage to face the world with who we really are, unafraid, unashamed, and unbent. Now, I won't mention particulars, but there is a movement afoot in our society to have courts of law which are not responsible to any electorate decide as a matter of fact what is truth in history. And if that ever establishes itself in our law, then we will see a form of thought policing, mind control unparalleled in not just this country, but the world. It will be possible for you on Friday next to find out what I mean. You'll not know till then, I cannot tell you. But Friday next, you'll know what direction freedom of speech in this country is going to go. And Friday next, you'll know too whether you have a place to play in defending it or not. And every Friday after that, the same question will have to be answered. What have I done? And all I can tell you is, I'll be answering the question to the best of my ability. I do hope you'll do the same. And I do know you will. One of the more fortunate things about most audiences confronted with a speaker is that as the speech progresses, the speaker's ability to read his own notes diminishes. And as a result, the speech grows shorter. I think then that it's about time for me to conclude by simply saying that if we're to build new guidelines of the definition of what it is to be a man or a woman, if we're to build new concepts of human dignity by our conduct, then no time could we be more grateful to live in than this one. The challenges and the struggles that are taking place today invite commitment that 10 years ago we wouldn't be required to make. I did not think, nor did anyone, that one would have to speak as I've spoken tonight for the cause of freedom of speech in this so-called free land. But times have changed and are changing. The things that will happen in the next year will change the course of history radically and dramatically. And therefore, this is a good time to live. And if need be, I remember the words of Chief Dan George in the movie Little Big Man, when he went out to fight a group of his enemies on a plain somewhere in the West. And he looked down from a hilltop over the clouds, and he looked over the prairies, and he looked over his enemies, and he looked over his friends. And he saw that his enemies far outnumbered his friends. But with the joy that every good warrior should have, he said, "It's a good day to die." And that's not pessimism at all. That is real hope, because if you can face life for what it is and face death for what it is without fear, without anything but a burning desire to be what you really are, then you know that you've really lived. Thank you very much.